This isn't just a story about an animal in pain. It's a story about protection, about sacrifice, about a bond so fierce it could break your heart. From high above, a drone camera captures the vast, frozen expanse of Baffin Bay, nestled between Greenland and Canada. Snow stretches out like an endless white blanket, reflecting the pale gray light of a gloomy sky. There's no sound but the howling wind cutting through the ice and snow. Amid this seemingly still landscape, a faint movement becomes clear. A lone female polar bear, heavy-set and deliberate, makes her way slowly across the ice. Clinging to her back is a tiny cub, curled up close, just big enough to grip her thick fur. Its wide eyes peer ahead, full of curiosity but edged with instinctive wariness. The mother never looks back. Each step she takes is slow but sure. Yet for the scientists watching this footage from a climate research station hundreds of miles away, the scene is far from simple. Inside the control cabin, researchers from the Canada-Greenland Arctic Survey team are glued to their monitors. The drone they're piloting is one of the most advanced ecological surveillance tools available, launched from a research vessel anchored far offshore. At first, the team assumed they were witnessing a routine hunting trek. As is common during the ice-sparse summer, the mother bear was likely heading south with her cub in search of food, conditions growing harsher every year. But something about her movement made the scientists fall silent. Liam, one of the researchers, leaned in toward the screen and murmured, "Her back left leg. It's off. Do you see that? She's limping." Just as Liam spoke, the drone captured the mother bear stopping in front of a narrow band of thin ice. A faint crack echoed. The ice beneath her trembled, splitting into jagged fractures. Everyone in the cabin instinctively leaned toward the screen as if their sheer will could steady her. Snow began to fall gently, partially veiling the spreading cracks. The bear froze, ears perked, eyes locked ahead. She didn't panic. Instead, she stepped back, paused, then carefully veered in a new direction, slower, safer. She wasn't just a forager. She was calculating. Minutes passed. Then the team noticed something odd. Rather than heading toward the scent trail of seals, her primary food source, the bear was turning northeast, toward a rapidly melting ice sheet. This was unusual. Mother bears typically avoid weak ice during summer due to the high risk of collapse. Why was she heading straight into the most dangerous part of the region? A veteran biologist named Marianne spoke softly. Maybe she's looking for shelter, for the cub. Sometimes, the instinct to protect a child outweighs even the will to survive. No one replied, but a heavy silence settled over the room. Deep down, each researcher began to sense that what they were witnessing was more than a routine search for food. Something greater, something urgent, was unfolding. The drone continued to document the journey, which was growing more perilous by the minute. Wind whipped stronger now, forming swirling eddies that sent snow drifting eerily through the air. On the screen, the mother bear pushed forward, but now the difference was unmistakable. Her back left leg dragged with every step. Her limp was no longer a question. It was a fact. With her next movement, her body wavered. She fought to stay balanced, ensuring the cub didn't slip from her back. Her claws dug into the ice, but the surface was no longer firm. Fine fractures spidered beneath her feet. The cub, only a few weeks old, remained still. Not because it wasn't afraid, but because survival in the wild begins with absolute silence. Each time the mother paused, the cub tucked deeper into her thick fur for warmth and wind cover. Its tiny frame, no bigger than a small dog, stood no chance against melting ice without her. Back in the control room, Marianne whispered, as if afraid to disturb the gravity in the air, "If the cub falls into the water now, it won't survive. Its fur isn't thick enough to retain heat. Its lungs aren't strong enough to hold breath." No one responded. Eyes locked on the screen, every muscle tense. They all knew, just one slip, one misplaced step, and this journey would end. The mother bear reached a wide fracture in the ice. Ahead lay a series of broken floes, drifting on dark, frigid water. The ice was no longer a continuous sheet, but a scatter of floating slabs, like planks on a stormy sea. Wind from the northwest howled, speeding their separation. She stopped, lowered her head, scanning the fractured path before her. Somehow, her instincts told her there was safety on the other side, at least a place to rest. But to reach it, she would have to leap from floe to floe. And with a failing hind leg, it was anything but simple. She crouched low and gently shifted her weight. The cub recognized the signal and slid down, clutching her front leg. She leapt on to the first slab. It wobbled violently, water splashing at the edges. A sharp crack echoed somewhere nearby, but she didn't pause. She turned, gently tugged the cub up with her snout, placed it back on her back, and jumped again. This time, her injured leg slipped. Her body slammed into the edge of the ice, claws screeching against the surface with a chilling sound. The drone caught it all, the flicker of pain in her eyes, the instant she fought to regain balance, never letting the cub fall. Wind howled louder, whipping snow into the drone's lens. One researcher wiped the monitor with a sleeve, never breaking gaze. The drone feed briefly cut out. When it returned, the bear was now in the middle of the drifting ice field. The team quickly overlaid drone footage with real-time satellite climate data. The prognosis was grim. This ice zone was now less than 15% of its average thickness 2 decades ago. It was one of the fastest melting regions in the Arctic. Liam, the group's meteorologist, murmured under his breath. A few decades ago, this path would have been easy. With ice this thin, even a strong adult wouldn't make it across. His words cut to the heart of the matter. Climate change isn't just numbers on a chart. It's a daily threat to every wild creature trying to survive. The floes beneath them began to spin slowly, tugged by underwater currents. The mother bear had to time each jump perfectly to stay on course. Every leap now was a blend of instinctive memory, survival reflex, and the desperate fear of failure. One wrong move, and the water would swallow them both whole, in sub-zero temperatures. But she didn't miss. Limping, exhausted, her body weakening, she kept jumping. One slab at a time, she pulled her cub forward, across a vanishing bridge, laid by nothing but the invisible hand of maternal instinct. The cub let out a soft whimper. For the first time since the journey began, it made a sound. Maybe it was the cold, maybe hunger, or maybe it had begun to feel its mother's exhaustion. The mother bear turned her head, gently pressed her snout to the cub's forehead, then continued forward. The drone caught the moment from an angle, soft skylight reflecting in the mother's deep brown eyes. Not the vacant stare of an animal, but something else. Awareness, of duty, of limits, of time running out. In the control room, no one sat anymore. The whole team stood, arms folded, holding their breath. One of the drone operators said quietly, "I have never seen a movement so deliberate." Marianne simply nodded, eyes fixed on the mother bear, who now leaned sideways again to steady her cub. The cold wind shrieked across the ice. Snow began to fall heavier, blurring the drone's visibility. On the screen, a large ice slab came into view, resting near the first solid land in miles. It was the final stretch. The slab was elevated above the water, its side glazed with thick, slick ice that rose like a wall, an unyielding barrier. Behind them, the fragile floes were breaking apart. Ahead was their only chance at survival. The mother bear stopped. She had reached her limit. In the control room, no one spoke. On screen, her breath puffed in broken clouds of white. She looked up at the icy wall, once, then again. She tried to hook a front paw over the edge and pull herself up, but her weakened hind leg couldn't hold the weight. She slipped. The second time, her body slammed hard against the ice. Claws scraped with a dry, gut-wrenching sound. The cub clung tightly to her back, ears flattened from cold and fear. She hadn't made a single sound the entire journey, but now the mother let out a low growl, just loud enough to rise above the wind. It wasn't anger or a cry for help. It was something else, a lone voice carried into the Arctic silence. Then she bowed her head and knelt, letting the cub slide off her back. It stumbled, but she caught it with her snout. In that instant, the drone recorded a small but unmistakable motion. The mother lowered her head all the way down and began to push the cub upward with all the strength she had left. She didn't lift it. She drove it upward, bit by bit. The first time, the cub slid back. She pushed again. The second time, it gripped the ice. She held it steady with her paw. The third time, with one final lunge, the cub reached the top. The mother stood below, watching. Her eyes followed the cub's shaky crawl across the frozen surface. It stumbled, then turned back. A gust swept away the powdery snow from the ice, revealing the cub's eyes, searching for its mother. But the mother didn't climb up. The drone kept filming, but no one in the control room could speak. What they were witnessing wasn't instinct. It was a choice. She stood in the icy water below, not trying again. Her body trembled visibly, fur soaked and heavy. But she didn't turn back. She didn't look behind her. She didn't search for another way. She just looked at her cub. Still, present. As if to confirm, it is safe now. Then, slowly, she stepped back. A researcher shot up from his seat. What is she doing? She could still try again. But Marianne shook her head, voice tight with emotion. Number. She knows. Her leg won't hold anymore. The drone's view shifted to an overhead shot. The cub, now steady on solid ice, stood facing the melting floes, where its mother had just stepped away from safety. No sound. No cry. Just utter stillness. The mother stood in the freezing water. She looked up at the dull sky, where snow and wind now swallowed the horizon. One last time, she turned her gaze toward her cub. Her dark eyes unchanged, not afraid, not resentful, only acceptance. Then she turned away. Step by step, the mother bear's exhausted body receded into the water. Snow fell heavier, masking her upper frame. The drone could no longer keep focus. The screen dissolved into a blur of white. The cub stood still. No cry, no whimper, no movement. It just kept staring toward the space where its mother had vanished. No one in the research center said a word. These were scientists, accustomed to nature's cycle of life and death. But no dataset, no biological theory could explain what they had just witnessed. No chart on species behavior could have predicted that decision. Marianne rested a hand on the desk and whispered, almost to herself, that wasn't a failure. That was a gift. The last gift of a mother. On the ice, the cub began to move. It turned its head once more, gazing into the emptiness. Then slowly, hesitantly, it started to walk, shivering, tentative, toward a faint glimmer of light in the distance. That's where the research team would find it, 2 days later. But in that moment, it was still just a wild child, standing alone in a melting wilderness. No sound, just the image of a cub in the wind, fur blowing back on a piece of ice left behind, and the invisible weight of a mother's final act. When confirmation arrived that the cub had survived, there was quiet relief in the room. But Marianne, lead biologist of the project, made a request to reanalyze all data related to the mother bear using AI pattern matching on her fur and gait to trace her identity. Not long after, the results left the room in silence. The mother had once appeared in a 2019 rescue report. She'd been found entangled in an illegal fishing net off northeast Greenland. The conservation team had to cut her free on a drifting ice sheet. Though released, her back left leg had been permanently damaged, deep, irreversible tissue loss from the tightened net. This was why she couldn't climb the final ledge. Not weakness, not surrender, but a known, unchangeable limit. Liam replayed segments of the journey, the careful jumps, the way she avoided fragile ice, the constant lifting of her cub rather than letting it walk. What once seemed like pure instinct now looked like intention, conscious calculation. Marianne turned to her colleagues. She didn't just know she was injured. She understood how far that injury would let her go, and instead of stopping, she chose to go as far as she could, not for herself, for her cub. A zoologist added quietly from the back, "In the wild, most mothers will abandon their young if they sense they can't survive together. But this was the opposite. She chose to stay behind." A scientific conference was held later that week, drawing Arctic ecologists from around the world. Marianne presented a finding that challenged long-standing assumptions about species behavior. We often separate survival instinct from maternal instinct, treating them as competing forces. Either the mother lives or the cub does. But this case reveals something deeper. Sometimes, sacrifice isn't the failure of instinct. It's the highest form of survival awareness, not for the self, but for the next generation. The story quickly spread through the global scientific community. In Canada, environmental and biology journals dubbed it a rare case of proactive maternal sacrifice in the wild. On specialist forums, experts began to question the long-accepted notion of the cold logic of nature, a phrase often used to describe the brutal realities of the Arctic. At one symposium, an Inuit biologist stood and said something that hushed the entire room. "My ancestors believed polar bears were more than hunters. They were guardians of the frozen world spirit. This story makes me believe there are mother spirits among them, ones who know their limits but still lead their young to the very end." Comparative insights followed. In many predator species, wolves, hyenas, snow leopards, maternal care often ends when survival odds fall too low. But this polar bear had reversed that pattern, ensuring her cub reached safety before stopping. Her actions didn't fit standard biological models. Instead, they aligned with a controversial concept: natural moral behavior, the idea that some animals may act against self-interest, not for individual gain, but for the greater good of their kind. On the drone screen, the final image remained, a silent frame captured and stored. The cub, small, shivering, stood motionless on the wind-scored snow. Its round head turned, wide brown eyes staring in the direction its mother had just disappeared into. Snow fell steadily, collecting on its thin fur. It didn't cry. It didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for something that would never return. That was the last footage the drone recorded before the signal vanished under the thickening storm. A scene with no dialogue, no music, Yet it left the entire survey team, seasoned in nature's harsh truths, quietly still for a long time. No one gave the order to shut it down. They simply sat, staring at the black screen, letting unspoken emotions fill the room. Two days later, during a routine patrol, a joint Greenland-Canada ecological team found the cub. It was curled in a snow hollow near the southern coast, eyes nearly closed from cold. But it was still breathing. They rushed it to a wildlife conservation center. For days, it refused food. It only looked around or lay still, as if it had nothing left to trust. But then, after a week of quiet visits from a caregiver who sat beside its enclosure each morning, it moved. A few days later, it took its first bite of fish. The center named it Hope, not to tug at heartstrings, but to honor the truth that some lives were never meant to survive, and yet they do, not through strength, but because another being gave everything to make it possible. At the end-of-year review, when asked what haunted her most, Marianne looked up at a still from the drone footage of the mother bear looking back at her cub one final time, and said, "She didn't survive, but what she left behind did." We've always looked to nature for lessons, about strength, adaptation, survival. But maybe the greatest lesson comes not in struggle, but in silence, in sacrifice. The story of the mother bear and the cub named Hope spread far and wide, not as a sensational headline, but as a quiet, powerful reminder. In a world growing warmer amid melting ice, there are still silent acts that deserve to be remembered. Not out of pity, but out of gratitude. Because sometimes life doesn't begin with strength. It begins with letting go.